Hey, it's Scott Wallace for TopTenz coming to you with another Fast 5. This time, 5 trials of the century. Every so often, there are trials that become so famous, they grab the attention of millions of people from around the world. These are 5 of those cases from the last century and the early part of this one, where the drama was so immense that the world became enraptured. Number 5. The Trial of Leon Czolgosz. The first trial of the century, of the 20th century, only lasted 8 hours, but it was a huge sensation because of who was killed. On September 6, 1901, President William McKinley was standing in a receiving line, greeting people at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York. Suddenly, 28-year-old anarchist Leon Czolgosz shot him twice at point-blank range, and McKinley died 8 days later. Czolgosz came from a poor immigrant family and shot McKinley because he thought that McKinley only helped the rich. Czolgosz refused to talk to his 2 lawyers, 2 former state Supreme Court judges, making it hard to come up with a defense. The trial started 9 days after McKinley died on September 23, 1901, and Czolgosz didn't testify in his own defense. He was found guilty and sentenced to death. He was executed on October 29, 1901, via the electric chair. Number 4. The Scopes Monkey Trial. In March 1924, Tennessee passed a law that made it illegal to teach the theory of evolution in schools. Obviously, not everyone supported this law, so John Scopes, a high school teacher in Dayton, and a local businessman named George Rapelier conspired for Scopes to get charged for breaking the law so they could challenge the ruling. The court case attracted 2 of the country's top lawyers, William Jennings Bryan, a 3-time Democratic presidential candidate who, incidentally, lost the 1900 election to William McKinley, volunteered to help the prosecution, while Clarence Darrow volunteered to help the American Civil Liberties Union in defending Scopes. The trial started on July 10, 1925, and attracted the attention of the country because it essentially represented what should be taught in schools: fundamental Christianity or science. The case didn't start off great for the defense because the judge opened each day with a prayer. Also, the defense wasn't allowed to argue that the law was unconstitutional. Near the end of the trial, Darrow changed tactics. He called Bryan, who was helping the DA, as a witness to defend Christian fundamentalism. During his examination, Darrow embarrassed Bryan by making him say contradictory and ignorant statements over his literal interpretation of the Bible. In his closing statement, Darrow asked the jury to return a verdict of guilty so that it could be appealed. The jury spent 8 minutes deliberating and returned a verdict of guilty. Scopes was fined $100, which was the minimum punishment. In 1927, the ruling was overturned on a technicality, but the law wouldn't be repealed until 1967. The play, and later Oscar-nominated movie, Inherit the Wind, tells the story of the infamous trial. Number 3. The Trial of Charles Manson. In August 1969, the United States was shocked by the brutal murders of 7 people in their upscale homes in Los Angeles. The most famous victim was actress Sharon Tate, who was the wife of film director Roman Polanski. She was 8.5 months pregnant. What made the crimes even more shocking were the people that were responsible for them. It was a cult-like group of hippies that consisted of pretty young women, led by a strange little man named Charles Manson. Due to the barbarity of the crimes and the weirdness of the culprits, the trial was a media circus. The members of the family that weren't arrested showed solidarity by doing whatever Manson did, like carve X's into their foreheads and shave their heads. At the courthouse, they would chant, sing, and treat the trial of a mass murderer like a picnic. In January 1971, Manson and several of his family members were found guilty and sentenced to death. The death penalty was abolished in 1972, and Manson's sentence was commuted to life in prison. Number 2. The Trial of O.J. Simpson. Just after midnight on June 13, 1994, O.J. Simpson's ex-wife, Nicole Brown Simpson, and her friend, Ronald Goldman, were found brutally murdered in front of Nicole's condominium. A short time later, a warrant was issued for O.J., and he agreed to turn himself in, but then went on the infamous slow car chase with his longtime friend, Al Cowlings. Eventually, Simpson was arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. Just some of the evidence the district attorney's office had against OJ was that he had a fresh cut on his finger and his blood was at the crime scene. Second, there was a blood-covered glove found on OJ's property. The blood belonged to OJ, Nicole, and Goldman. Third, there was a sock found in his bedroom that had his blood and Nicole's blood on it. There was also a bloody shoe print found at the scene from a size 12 Bruno Magli, a pretty rare shoe, and OJ wore size 12 shoes. Finally, the police had been called several times to the home of Nicole and OJ because OJ was an abusive husband. Of course, the evidence was only a small aspect of what became the definitive trial of the 20th century. The defense's strategy was to show that the Los Angeles Police Department had a history of systemic racism and had planted the evidence to set up one of the most famous African Americans in the world. The trial essentially came down to the credibility of the LAPD. The DA pretty much had a slam dunk case, but all the defense had to do was create reasonable doubt by making it sound like it was possible that the LAPD could have set OJ up because he was African American. On October 3rd, 1995, the jury was back with a verdict. 150 million Americans tuned in, which was about 57% of the population. The verdict was, of course, not guilty. OJ would later go on to lose a civil trial against Goldman's family in 1997. Then, in 2008, OJ was convicted of robbery and kidnapping and was sentenced to 9 to 33 years in prison. Number 1. The Trial of Michael Jackson. In the early 2000s, Michael Jackson was already the world's most famous weirdo. Besides his odd appearance and strange personal life, since a civil suit in 1993, there had been rumors that Jackson was having inappropriate relationships with children. But things got worse for the King of Pop in February 2003 when a documentary called Living with Michael Jackson was released. And in it, Jackson talks about sleeping with children in his bed. The documentary led to a police investigation, and on November 18, 2003, the day after Jackson released his greatest hits album, his home, Neverland Ranch, was searched. The next day, a warrant was issued, and Jackson turned himself in on November 20th. Jackson's trial started on January 31, 2005, and the district attorney didn't have much in the way of physical evidence. Instead, the case mostly rested on the accusations of one boy, a 13-year-old cancer patient. The DA said that the accusations fit a pattern, even though Jackson had never been convicted of sexual assault, or any crime for that matter, except perhaps for Michael Jackson's Moonwalker for the Sega Genesis. Yuck! The trial lasted 6 months, and it was a spectacle. Jackson's odd appearance and outrageous wardrobes were interesting enough to attract millions of viewers every day. On June 13th, nearly 6 months after the trial started, the jury unanimously acquitted Jackson of all charges. He ended up dying 4 years later on June 25th, 2009. Okay guys, that's all for this time. Be sure to click subscribe for more great videos from TopTenz, and be sure to join me for the next Fast 5.